Welcome to myCloudUni. This is an introductory session on AWS DMS, the Data Migration Service. In this session, we will try to see what DMS service is and how it works. We will also see a brief demo of DMS in action. So what is DMS? DMS is a managed service from AWS for migrating data to and from AWS. It helps you to migrate data quickly into AWS and also securely. You can use this service to move data not only into AWS but also move data from AWS to other places such as your on-premise or maybe other cloud. So DMS supports a number of data sources. It supports commercial popular databases such as SQL Server or Oracle. It supports a number of AWS services such as S3 or DynamoDB, where you can write data to. It basically supports both the homogeneous and heterogeneous type of migrations. What this means is you can actually have your source as SQL Server and your target as probably mySQL, or you can read from Oracle and then write it into S3. So that is heterogeneous, or you can read from SQL Server and write it into SQL Server. That is homogeneous migration. So DMS supports both homogeneous and heterogeneous migrations. DMS also supports CDC, or change data capture, where you can do the migration of all your data and also start streaming your changes in terms of when the source data changes, those changes would get sent to your target. So essentially you can use this to stream your changes from source to your target. And one of the good thing about DMS is it requires a minimal downtime. Your source database remains fully operational when you are doing data migration. So this way, it is one of the really good feature of AWS, where DMS actually lets you work with your on-premise databases if you're migrating from there to AWS without requiring you to stop it. And finally, it is relatively a less expensive solution compared to custom data, because it does understand some of the traditional databases in terms of how the data types are there and things like that. So essentially, if you are considering migrating data from one of the traditional on-premises databases, definitely is worth looking at AWS DMS service. So let's look at the DMS architecture closely. Central to the DMS architecture is the replication instance. So you create a replication instance, you provision it initially, and this is very similar to how you choose an EC2 instance. Typically you give very small number of parameters and then your replication instance would be up and running. You choose the size of the instance like how you choose EC2 instance size, and very few parameters, whether you want single AZ or multi-AZ, and then your replication instance would be up and running. And how this replication works is, let's say you've got a data source or multiple data sources and you've got targets. Essentially what replication instance does is it reads from the data sources and it actually lets you write to the target destination databases. So what we are seeing on the left hand side are the currently supported data sources, which you can see that there are different types of databases that are supported, like the relational databases such as Oracle, SQL Server, Azure SQL, Postgres, and so on and so forth. Similarly, you see that as a data source you can have a AWS data source such as S3 or DocumentDB. Similarly, on the target side, you can actually write your data to, let's say, relational database, like it could be an Oracle instance running as an RDS, or maybe Oracle instance on EC2, or it could be a DynamoDB, a non-SQL type of database, or it could be Kinesis data stream. One important thing to make a note is that what you see on the left hand side and right hand side exactly doesn't match. That means essentially actually when you start your thinking about your migration, first thing you have to see is whether your database that you are considering for migration is one of the supported databases or not as a source. For example, if you want to migrate from, let us say, DB2, yes, it is supported, but whereas if you want to write data to DB2, it is not supported by DMS. So definitely worth looking at DMS documentation to see what are the current supported sources and targets with DMS. And once you decide, and then once you get the replication instance up and running, then what it does is it lets you connect and read from the source data and load it into the target. Then you are going to create the endpoints. There are two types of endpoints: source endpoints and target endpoints. And these endpoints are nothing but the connection information. Let's say that you've got Oracle database on-prem, so this endpoint will hold information such as the host name, the port number, and the username, password, etc. And once you define an endpoint, the replication instance would try to connect to it and say, yes, I can read from this source endpoint. Similarly, you can have target endpoint. So basically, once you know what is your source and where you want to write to, the next step after creating replication instance is you create at least one source endpoint and one target endpoint. You can have many sources and many targets likewise. And once you have the endpoints up and running, then you actually define the tasks, replication tasks. These tasks actually will define in terms of what schema objects that you want to migrate from source to target. For example, you can specify all tables from particular schema or multiple schemas. I want from this source endpoint, and then write it into the, let's say, a target endpoint in DynamoDB. So replication task actually defines your basically schema objects, and also it does support a little bit of transformation, not a great deal, but you can say that I want to apply these filters when I am getting the data, and then I want to change these column names. Very rudimentary transformation is supported in the replication tasks. So basically what you get from this slide is that the DMS architecture consists of a replication instance, and then you define the endpoint, source endpoint and target endpoints, and then you define the replication tasks. And there is also another component called as the schema conversion tool, which actually you can use. It is one of the service, again part of DMS, which you can use to, let's say, convert from, let's say, one of the Oracle database to, let's say, MySQL database, in terms of converting the stored procedures and things like that. But obviously it can work independently. So when you can actually completely work without even looking at the schema conversion tool. So the main takeaway from this slide is that you have to pre-provision your replication instance, and once you create it, it will be up and running. Unlike the EC2 instances, you can't stop it, and also you can't easily access it like how you access the EC2 instances. But once it is up and running, you actually will define your endpoints, and then you define your replication tasks, and then you can start doing the migration. And again, let's look at closely in terms of how this replication does work. Let's say you've got a data source which is an on-prem Oracle database, and let's say your target is an S3 bucket. Let's say you've got a source endpoint and target endpoint defined, and then you've got replication instance as well up and running. So what this replication task does is it defines whether you want a full load, or whether you want a full load as well as ongoing replication, or just an ongoing changes to be streamed to the target. So under the hood, what a replication instance does is whenever you define a task, it will create the replication process, and then it will maintain what changes are happening on the source, and then it will actually stream them to the target. So basically it does under the hood do the source load and target load, which is reading from all the table data and writing it to the target. Similarly, the source capture and target apply, which is nothing but find the changes that are happening on the source and then apply it to the target. So it's full load plus CDC that keeps happening once you define a replication task and define the endpoints. The replication instance does the job under the hood. Again, you can have multiple replication tasks from the same source endpoint. Similarly, you can have the same target endpoint used by multiple replication tasks. You can just have one replication instance, but you can have many number of source endpoints and target endpoints. There are some limits out there, but it's generally good actually to have one or two replication instances, and then you can do pretty large number of migrations. Again, you can actually define these endpoints, and then here the other example is from SQL Server. You're writing it into Kinesis data stream. It works exactly in the same way. The replication instance pretty much manages the migration for you. Okay, in this demo, what we are going to see is we will create a replication instance, and then we create an endpoint for an existing already MySQL database. And then we create a target endpoint for a DynamoDB table which is already there, and we create a replication task which does the full load plus the CDC, the ongoing change data capture, and then we'll see how data flows. There is a detailed demo that we will do subsequently, but in this session we already got the MySQL database and the DynamoDB table created. Please look at the detailed demo for exact instructions, but in this one we'll try to quickly go through this and then see how it works. AWS admin console, and there is an Aurora MySQL database up and running, and we will connect to this Aurora database using a client software. In this case we are using SQL Electron. You can use actually anything, and let us see what tables we want to transfer to DynamoDB in this demo. So let's navigate to it and see. Start from, there is a schema called mySchema, and it has got an emp table, and let us see if it has got any entries in it. As you can see there is a schema, mySchema, and it has got an emp table, and it has got two columns, emp ID and emp name. This has been already populated with some data. As you can see, there are 4 records in here, and we will create a DMS replication instance and task and send this to a DynamoDB table. Let us see that there is already a table which is created here, emp table in DynamoDB, and this has got a partition key of emp ID which is matching with the emp ID column that we see in the other MySQL database, and then we will see that the data comes through it. As you can see here, there is no data in this DynamoDB table at the moment, so we create a replication instance, replication task, and then see that the data flows through. So let's go to the DMS console here, and in the DMS console we will create a replication instance. We say it is my first replication instance. Sorry, there are a few typos here. You can leave the optional fields blank, and here you choose the instance class, and we choose the smallest one, T3 micro, and this is probably going to cost you less, and then you choose the engine version. We leave everything to defaults, and then we choose the VPC, and the VPC here is the default VPC where the database is already there, so we will just make sure that this is the same VPC as where our database is already created, and yeah, so the VPC is ending with the 7B4, and that's what we see here. And then we leave the multi-AZ option to default, which means it's single AZ. Again, leave all the things to defaults, and then we actually just press the create. It would take a few seconds for you to create the instance, a few minutes, and then we'll come back. Sorry, here you have to choose the production or dev test workload, and we choose single AZ for dev test workload. Hopefully it will create the replication instance. Okay, yeah, let's probably pause for a minute here to AWS DMS console, and here we have created 2 endpoints. One is a source endpoint pointing to the MySQL RDS instance, and the second one is a DynamoDB target endpoint. These have been created upfront, but we'll have a detailed session where we can see this in detail. But as you can see here, it contains the informations as to what is the host server name and port number, etc. And then it also contains the username and password, etc. But we will see this in detail later. Now the replication instance is created. You can see the status as available. It took about 4 or 5 minutes for AWS to create this replication instance, and once this instance is up and running, you can create the migration tasks, and remember that unlike an EC2 instance, you can't stop a replication instance. Once it is up, it is going to be running all the time. If you want, you have to terminate it. If you want to stop it, there is no other option. So that's why it is important to make sure that you choose the size of the replication instance correctly. So let us define a migration task to define a task which moves data from the source MySQL database to DynamoDB. Create task, and here we say that my RDS to DynamoDB task, and you can leave the things to default. Here you have to choose the replication instance. We have got only one rep instance, which is my first rep instance, and the source endpoint we actually choose the MySQL database endpoint. This has been already created for you. Similarly, the endpoint for the target is also created for you, and here we can choose whether you want to do a migrate existing data or migrate data with ongoing changes or just the ongoing changes. So we will choose the migrate existing data and replicate ongoing changes, and then we can leave a lot of these things to default, which we'll see in the next subsequent session. But let us choose the table mappings here, and in the table mappings here we can define the rules, what we want to migrate from the source to the target, or we can use a wizard. So in this case, let's use a wizard, and we'll say that the selection rule is that we want a specific schema, which is my schema. We don't want other schemas to be considered, and then we just want to migrate only the emp table, and then we can define some extra parameters such as the filters, whether you can say the where conditions that need to be applied, and some rudimentary transformation rules, which we will leave everything to default. And then we can say automatically on create it will start the task. So we'll try to create the task, and it would take probably a minute or two for the task to be created, and as soon as the task is created, the data starts moving from source to the destination. As you can see here, when the task is getting created, you can see that the task type is a full load and ongoing replication, and the source is the my Aurora database, and the target is my DynamoDB target. So the task is ready, and we can actually start the task right now and see what will happen. Now the task is getting started, and we can just refresh to see what happens. We can see the table stats in terms of how many records are moved from source to the target. So under the hood, the replication instance is using the endpoints and the task definition to connect to the source and then get the data as defined in the task and then load it into the target, which is the DynamoDB table. You can see the task status has changed to running, and it says that it has completed the load state, and the number of records it has loaded is 4. Let's verify that. We go to the DynamoDB table here, and in the emp table we see the table items, and we just run the query, and we can see that yes, it has received the 4 records here. Just to prove that this is indeed working, let's try to insert few rows here in the table and then see that they carry through to the DynamoDB table. Insert into emp values. Insert into let's execute. We insert a couple of records. Yes, they went through. And let's see what happens on the DynamoDB side. As you can see there, straight away DynamoDB has received these 2 records. You can also see these stats here. If you refresh it here, you should see 2 extra inserts that have happened right now. Just finally, before we wrap up, it's not only the insertion of the data. We will, let's say that we delete from emp where emp id is less than 6. We will delete all but 1 record. Okay, and now if we go back to DynamoDB table, we should just see only 1 record here. That's it. So pretty much this is the demo, the summary. AWS DMS is a useful service to migrate data or databases into or from AWS. It requires upfront provisioning of a replication instance, and you pay for the resources that the replication instance, whatever you configure for. And the DMS supports a variety of data sources and targets, but bear in mind that there are some limitations. You have to see whether the databases that you want to deal with are either supported or not. And then you create the source and target endpoints, and then you create the replication tasks, and pretty much that is what would get you up and running with the AWS DMS. And then you can consider using SCT for DB schema conversions. And finally, don't forget to delete unused resources, otherwise you could start incurring charges. Once again, thanks for joining this session.